All right, so I guess I'll introduce myself. I'm Anthony Garufalis Ogier. I'm a third-year student, and I'm also a volunteer with Divest Concordia. So welcome to this workshop, and I'll kind of break it down how it's going to go for the next while. I'm going to start off with just a presentation of the history of the divestment movement and a history of the tactic of divestment and how it's worked in the past. Then I will go over how it's been used in other campaigns and how now it's being used against fossil fuel industry, and how we're planning on running this campaign at Concordia University in the coming months. And then also talk a bit about how to get involved in this campaign and what we plan on doing. And I'll just start off really quickly with an explanation of exactly what divestment is. So if you look in the New Oxford American Dictionary, divestment is the action or process of selling off subsidiary business interests or investments. So if somebody has investments and they sell them off to somebody else, that would be what divesting is. And that's really what the crux of this campaign is to get university divested. But before I get to that, in our campaign, I'll start off with this slide. And I don't know if can people read this? Maybe. But anybody know where this is from? So I guess, it's a little bright in here. So I'll just read it out. It says white persons only. So it's actually from South Africa. This was in apartheid South Africa, probably a couple of decades ago. And in South Africa, there was a system of apartheid, which is the tyranny of racism made law. So there was segregation in the country, and the black population was treated quite differently than the white. Their economic opportunities were restricted. A lot of them were forced through poverty and in slums. And here, this is a picture from 1985, where you have a young South African who has a passbook, and the passbook lets him know where he cannot live, or where he can and cannot live. So it was really a system of oppression for the black population there, and kind of a remnant, relic of the colonial system in Africa. But around this was people that were organizing, and there was movements within South Africa organizing against apartheid. And there's the African National Congress, which Nelson Mandela was part of. And then there was other movements within that country, and then there was also movements outside, solidarity networks against apartheid. And you have a picture here of one of them, and this is from a while ago. But throughout the 20th century, this was a big issue, and people were trying to stop the system of apartheid in South Africa. And it actually took a while before it actually ended. And here it kind of relates back to the divestment campaign. So we have, can't really read it, but it says Chase Manhattan, which is a bank in Wall Street, the partner in apartheid with over $50 million in South Africa. So Chase Manhattan Bank was investing in companies that were supporting the South African government at the time in apartheid. And people are actually starting to talk about investments as when you invest in something that it actually, you're acting or supporting what you're investing in. So it's kind of shareholder activism that was kind of coming to the fore. So in the 1960s, this became really popular with church-based or faith-based communities in the United States. So you had churches starting to remove their investments from companies that were supporting the Vietnam War, and also companies that were involved in apartheid. And it took off slowly. There wasn't many funds that were starting to do this, but steadily there was more and more people and institutions that were starting to do divestment from companies that were supporting South African government. And a university divestment campaign started. And in 1977, Hampshire University was the first university to divest from South Africa. University students there started a large campaign, and then they tried to spread it in other university campuses. But it took a while before it actually took off, and before this really became a movement in solidarity with and really like something really big that would put enough pressure on Western elites to stop their support. So by 1984, 7 years later, only 53 campuses divested. But at that point, it was really starting to pick up. So 4 years later, you had 155 university campuses, university and colleges campuses across North America that were divested from South Africa. And that put a lot of pressure on the South African government. And it caused really raised a lot of public awareness about the issue. So in solidarity with regular South Africans who are putting their lives at risk, sometimes dying and facing imprisonment like Nelson Mandela, we were able to get rid of apartheid in South Africa. And in 1994, Nelson Mandela became the first democratically elected president of South Africa, and the system of apartheid was removed. And the reason why I mentioned this story of South Africa is just because it's a good way to look at divestment and understand how it can work as a tactic. So divestment put economic pressure on South African elites to change their laws. So how did that happen? Well, there was money that was removed, so they realized they're losing funds to finance themselves, but also created significant public awareness in the imagination of people outside of South Africa. So through the divestment and through talking to people on university campuses and doing these campaigns, doing petitions and speaking to people about it, more and more people knew about what was going on in South Africa, and then more and more people started to think about, well, where am I going to put my vote? And am I going to put it in the government that's going to be supporting South Africa, or the South African government? So it took a while before Western governments started to stop their support of South Africa, but with this public awareness, they realized that their legitimacy was being called into question because of the support of this racist system of law. And just to really, I guess I'll quote Desmond Tutu, who's an archbishop from South Africa, but he said that the end of apartheid stands as one of the crowning accomplishments of the past century, but we would not have succeeded without the help of international pressure. And he adds that the divestment campaigns of the 1980s were very important in putting that international pressure. So divestment as a tactic was then used in other campaigns. So against the tobacco industry, McGill, Concordia had divestment campaigns against the tobacco industry. Military companies, Concordia a few years back had a divestment campaign against military companies. And then now there's a fossil fuel campaign, or divestment campaign against the fossil fuel industry. So why fossil fuels? Well, and why did Divest Concordia choose fossil fuels as what we want the university to divest from? I'll go over 4 reasons why we think that we should be divesting from fossil fuels, and there's other ones, but we'll make it short. So first is climate change. So we know that 80% of proven fossil fuel reserves have to stay in the ground if we are going to prevent a dangerous level of warming, so a 2-degree rise in temperature. But at the current rate of extraction, we're way past 2 degrees Celsius. And according to the World Bank, in a report that they released last year, so present emission trends put the world plausibly on the path towards a 4 degrees Celsius warming within this century. And just last week, the Brazilian National Conference on Climate Change released their own report, and they said that the Amazon jungle faces a 3 to 6 degree rise in temperature, which could lead to droughts in Brazil and really harm the Amazon rainforest and possibly even emit more emissions once forests dry up. So what would a 4-degree world look like? Well, just go over what the World Bank says a 4-degree world would look like. And the World Bank's not really a radical organization, so I think this is a conservative estimate. So the world that is 4 degrees warmer is so different from the current one that it comes with high uncertainty and new risks that threaten our ability to anticipate and plan for future needs. The lack of action on climate change not only risks putting prosperity out of reach for millions of people in the developing world, it also threatens to roll back decades of sustainable investment. So they're really warning that the world can drastically change, and the world that's 4 degrees warmer will be drastically different than the one that we currently live in. And they're expecting 4 degrees temperature within this century, so by 2100, and they put a 20% possibility by 2070. But just to imagine a world at 4 degrees warmer, it's actually interesting to look at what a world 2 degrees warmer would look like, which is what we're going to be passing at some point in the early part of the century if we continue with current carbon emissions. So at 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperature, parts of the planet will become uninhabitable. And I'm sure a lot of people have seen the Inconvenient Truth, or the Al Gore documentary, where he shows what parts of the world will be flooded. Areas of Bangladesh, a lot of coastal cities will be completely flooded, displacing millions of people. We're facing the mass extinction of species, of animal species, of mammals. And just in Quebec, we've noticed a drop in bird populations in the east of the province because the warm foot of water has been bringing fish further away, and the birds are unable to bring back the food in time for their nests. So we've been seeing a collapse in the bird population, and there's a possibility of seeing extinction or the migration of birds in areas that they're not used to. So we don't really know what the effects of that will be, but it's very worrisome. Mass migration of people, I went over that before when I'm saying that parts of the planet will become uninhabitable, but also not just because of flooding, but also because of heat waves and parts of the world that will become too hot for people to actually live in. So they'll have to move out of those areas. Millions of people will be pushed into poverty, and this is because of the mass migration of people. So when places are going to flood, if we're not prepared, then people will have nowhere to go and they're going to fall back into poverty. And there's going to be much more extreme weather events, and they're going to be much more unpredictable than they currently are. So this is kind of what we're facing with 2-degree rise in temperature, and imagine a 4-degree rise in temperature, or even a 6, like the Brazilian conference is predicting. So how do we prevent a 2-degree rise in temperature? Well, as I mentioned earlier, we have to keep 80% of fossil fuel emissions, or fossil fuels that we currently know exist in the ground. So that's quite a lot. So we're going to have to drastically reduce our fossil fuel consumption. We also have to cut emissions by more than 90% below 1990 levels by 2050. And we're presently nowhere near that in North America. We're actually far behind European countries when it comes to emission reduction targets. Quebec has the most ambitious one, so we want to reduce our emissions 25% below 1990 levels by 2020, but we don't go anywhere beyond that, where other countries have plans all the way up to 2050. So there needs to be some political pressure there if we want to stay below 2-degree rise in temperature. We also have to halt tar sands and fossil fuel extraction, as I mentioned earlier, and we have to move away from dirty forms of energy and really start to reinvest in alternatives, renewable energy, and different types of initiatives. And I'll talk a bit about that actually afterwards, about alternatives. So the second reason why we think that we shouldn't be investing in the fossil fuel industry is that the oil industry undermines democracy. So we've all seen the news and heard about lobbyists that corporations pay to go talk to politicians and try to buy favors. This happens all over the place, but the fossil fuel industry is one of the major financiers of lobbyists. And I was reading in L'Actualité this morning, and just in Quebec, the fossil fuel industry has 47 lobbyists that are currently trying to push for the pipelines to be brought into Quebec. And they're working full time, and people working in the public interest do not have the resources to compete against lobbyists that are financed by these multi-billion-dollar transnational corporations. And they really have their tentacles everywhere in government and around the world. A third reason why we think we shouldn't be investing in fossil fuels is the geopolitics of oil. So we all remember in 2003, the United States invaded Iraq on false pretenses, and we found out afterwards a lot of information about the connections between Bush administration and fossil fuel industry, and about how they wanted to extend U.S. hegemony over the region for long-term geopolitical interests and for control of fossil fuel reserves. And we have an interesting documentary called The Seven Sisters that is recommended on one of the papers that we have in our information packages, and we highly recommend people to watch that if you want to know more about the geopolitics of oil. And the fourth reason is pollution. So we hear a lot about spills that happen and about contamination of the air and water supplies. And I'll just go over some of the numbers, but the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico that happened a couple of years ago, there was 4.9 million barrels of oil that were dumped in, or that were released in the Gulf of Mexico. Exxon Valdez in the 1990s, 11 million gallons of crude oil were released in the reefs area on the coast of Alaska. And one of the biggest lawsuits in human history, Chevron Texaco, was found guilty of deliberately dumping toxic waste or toxic sludge in the Amazon rainforest in Ecuador. And the amount that they dumped was over 16 billion barrels of highly toxic sludge. So it was a huge environmental catastrophe, and they had to pay over $18 billion in cleaning up costs, and they just lost that court case a few years ago. And in Canada, closer to home, we have Fort Chipewyan and the Athabasca Fort Athabasca Chipewyan First Nations, who are currently fighting against the contamination of their water and also for cleaner air. The Athabasca River in Fort Chipewyan is downstream from Fort McMurray, one of the largest tar sand extraction sites. So that kind of gives you an idea of what's going on here. There's an interesting documentary if you want to know more about this called To the Last Drop, available for free on Al Jazeera, and it's also in our recommendations of documentaries. And really, pollution is one of the reasons, and one of the first reasons why this divestment movement against fossil fuels started. So you had a group called Swarthmore Mountain Justice, and this is in 2010. They were a group out of Swarthmore College, which is a nice liberal arts college in Pennsylvania near Philadelphia. And these group of students were upset about mountaintop removal mining that was happening in the area and also around the United States. And I got an image here of what it looks like. So mountaintop removal is a very polluting form of mining for coal, where you completely take off the top of a mountain, you just dig into it to extract resources. So it's extremely energy intensive, but also coal is a form of fossil fuel. And we know that we have to keep fossil fuels, a vast majority of it, in the ground. But the Swarthmore Mountain Justice decided that they're going to start a campaign against their college to get them to divest from the fossil fuel industry as a whole. And they started this campaign about 3 years ago. But since then, now in 2013, there's over 300 campuses across North America that are joining on to this divestment campaign, thanks to large organizations and climate justice organizations that have been really spreading the word. And this campaign has come to a lot of campuses, some of them that we know, but Harvard University, Columbia University has their own campaign, University of Toronto, and the University of McGill. And McGill's had a campaign going on for over a year now, some challenges. But it's also spread beyond just the university campuses. There's cities now, or whole cities that are disinvesting their pension plans from the fossil fuel industry. So we have San Francisco in California, Berkeley in California, Madison, Wisconsin, and Seattle, Washington that have divested their pension plans. And they're large sums of money from the fossil fuel industry, and I've also made statements saying that others should do the same. Montreal is not divested at this point. We'll just add that. Universities that have succeeded in divesting, and so far from what I know, there's about 6 colleges in the United States that have succeeded. Unity College in Maine, with enthusiastic support of their president, has divested, and he's been calling on other universities to do the same and to make the switch away from fossil fuels and into renewable energy. And then now the campaign has come to Concordia University, and we have Divest Concordia. So Divest Concordia was formed by a group of students last year, including myself, after we visited some environmental conferences in Canada and the United States and saw that there was campaigns happening in other places. And after we learned about how this divestment can help bring awareness around the issue of fossil fuels and the negative impacts that it has on the environment, we thought it'd be a good idea to bring it here, and something that Concordia should adopt itself, or it should do itself. So what are our goals? So Divest Concordia wants Concordia to freeze its investments, our current investments in the fossil fuel industry that it currently has. After that, we want them to disinvest in over 3 years completely from the fossil fuel industry. We also want them to adopt a social and environmental responsibility policy for their investments. So this would help ensure that there's ethical guidelines for all their investments and not just when it comes to fossil fuels. And then we also want to have student representation on the committee that will formulate this policy so that we can have our say. So how does Concordia invest, or how does a university invest? And why is a university investing in the first place? Well, the university has 2 reasons to invest. The first is their endowment fund. So I've mentioned this, and it's mentioned in our information material, but what exactly is an endowment fund? Go to the next slide. An endowment fund, really simply, is kind of a university's savings account. So the university has 2 types of accounts. It has what's called the operating budget and an endowment. So the operating budget works as sort of as your checking account. So you make expenses during the year using the operating budget to pay teachers and salaries and the maintenance costs of the university. And this money comes from tuition and grants that they receive from the government. But it also has an endowment, which is the savings account of the university. It's there to grow and to make interest on it. So that's made up of alumni donations and major gifts that people give to the university. So Concordia has over $100 million worth, $100 million in their endowment, and about 11 million of that is invested in fossil fuel and fossil fuel related industries. So we have about 9 million in fossil fuels and about 2 million in pipelines. And we know this because Concordia University releases a financial audit of their endowment every year, and it has the investments broken down into different categories. And you can ask me later where you can see that, but it's quite interesting to look at. And so I've been talking a lot about why we want them to get disinvest in the fossil fuel industry. What exactly do we want them to reinvest in? So what are we proposing as alternatives? And I guess it'd be nice to see them to reinvest in renewable energy, so wind turbines, solar panels, insulation, and electrification of transportation or electric transport. But we opted so far for something a little different, and that's the social and environmental responsibility policy. Because at that point, then we can bring up other issues that might be happening, but we can set really good guidelines. And the reason why we want a policy is because we've seen in other universities that have divested in the past that without a policy, a few years down the road, they can just reinvest in those same companies because there's nothing that binds them to investing ethically. So we want to kind of do like what Amherst College has done in the United States. So students there were pushing to have an advisory committee for socially responsible investing of their endowment fund, and they've succeeded in having it. And they also have student representation on it. And what we want to see Concordia adopt, very similar to Amherst, is sustainable and responsible investing. And this is a type of investment that's becoming very, very popular. But we think that Concordia, for their image of being a sustainable campus and because it promotes itself, it would be in their best interest to adopt this type of investing. And this is actually becoming much more popular. It's not just on the fringes, it's become much more mainstream, and by 2015, it's expected that about 15 to 20% of all investments are going to be done through sustainable and responsible investment. And there's growing calls by international institutions, including the World Bank and the United Nations, to move towards sustainable and responsible investing because of growing mega trends like climate change, demographic changes, and resource scarcity. And an excellent example of sustainable and responsible investing, and that to show that it can be done, is PKA, which is a company that manages one of the largest pension funds in all of Denmark. So it's about $20 billion. And PKA has very interesting ethical guidelines. It uses UN conventions on human rights, labor rights, environment, and corruption to guide their investments. So they won't invest in companies that violate those UN conventions. So that's one example that we can use to kind of guide ourselves or use when it comes time to talk about alternatives. But also Concordia can learn a bit about itself. So not many people know, but Concordia is the first university, or at least it claims to offer a professional certification, in sustainable investment. So this is out of their business school, and it's actually an excellent program, and it teaches investment or fund managers how to invest sustainably. So it could learn a bit from itself. But how do we get the university to listen? I'm sure some of you are new to the university, so I'll kind of go over exactly the steps that we would need to take, or who are the decision makers that we have to put pressure on if we want them to adopt this, and I want them to divest. So the highest decision-making body, the non-academic decision-making body of the university, is the Board of Governors. And the Board of Governors is made up of different individuals, some from the community, some from the broader Montreal community, some from the university, so faculty members, and even students. But a lot of these individuals are also wealthy elites, or business elites from Montreal. So for example, you have Michael Novak, who's Executive Vice President of SNC Lavalin, who sits on the Board of Governors of Concordia University. You have Normand Bad, who's the President and CEO of Group Park Avenue, one of the largest cars sales company in Montreal. And you have Georges Paulez, Managing Director and CEO of Mirabeau Canada, which is an international financial group. And we have other people as well, other wealthy individuals that sit on the Board of Governors, but they're the ones that make the decisions. And luckily we have our own representation. So we have 2 students that sit on the Board of Governors, and that is CSU President, and the GSA has, the Graduate Student Association also has representation. So the Board of Governors gets to make that decision, and would have to vote on this, and then it would go to the University Endowment Fund. So the University Endowment Fund, or Concordia University Foundation, is the endowment fund of the university, and they have fund managers who would then have to adopt the guidelines that are made for them, or that have been given to them by the Board of Governors. And really, the crux of this campaign is to really put pressure on these decision makers to divest. And how can we do that? So what types of engagements can students get involved in to join on this campaign and put pressure on the university? Well, the first is you can come to one of our weekly meetings. So every Friday we hold a meeting in the GSA house on 2030 Mackay, and information is in our information pamphlets. And that's where we talk about organizing the campaign, about what's going to be coming up in the next months, organizing different events and 101 workshops, and training for tabling. But if you don't have time for the organizing, and that because you work or because of a lot of schools commitments, you can also help with tabling, which doesn't take too much time, and it's also a great way to learn about the fossil fuel industry because you get to communicate it with others, but you also get to communicate the alternatives to fossil fuels. And another way that you can help is by sending a letter to the Concordia University administration. So currently we're working on a website that will have a draft letter that you can send to the administration. You can change it yourself, and you can change what's written, and you just have to type in your name, your email address, and click the send button, and it'll be sent to the key administrators in the university. So it's a really simple way to help put pressure on the university that doesn't take more than 10 minutes. Another way is just to tell your classmates. So if you know people that are upset with the fossil fuel industry, let them know that there's a campaign going on, and that'll help recruit people to take this campaign on. And I'll just end this presentation with one last slide, which you can't really see all the words because of the light, but what it says is vote yes to ban the sale of bottled water on campus. So some of you might have been here a few years ago, but Concordia University had an exclusivity contract with PepsiCo for selling beverages on campus, which included Aquafina. And students were upset that we were selling bottled water, which is actually tap water, Aquafina at least, at the university, and wanted to see the university ban bottled water and also create water fountains where you can use reusable bottles. And they started this campaign to get the university to do this, and to put in a lot of pressure on the university through squatting their administrator's office. They had a referendum, and they also just held protests around school and really raised a little bit of a ruckus at the university. We managed to be one of the first universities in Quebec to do it, and UQAM usually has a reputation for being the radical university, but UQAM still sells bottled water. So Concordia is a bit of a leader when it comes to sustainability on our campus. But I mentioned this story because it shows that we could get the university to listen. And hopefully this campaign will be successful in getting the university to divest. Thank you.